At the dawn of the 20th century, the United States found itself entangled in a brutal colonial war across the Philippine archipelago. While much of that conflict raged in the northern islands, a far more complex and deadly struggle was unfolding in the south. In Mindanao and the scattered islands of the Sulu archipelago, here lived the Moros, Muslim Filipinos, whose identity was forged over centuries of independent sultanates, deep Islamic faith, and an unbreakable tradition of armed resistance. Unlike the Christian Filipino groups Americans had already encountered in the north, the Moros operated under entirely different political, religious, and cultural systems. Their loyalty belonged not to any colonial government, but to their sultans, their datus, and their faith. When American soldiers marched into Moro territory, expecting the same resistance they had already overcome elsewhere, they discovered something far more formidable. A people who had never truly been conquered and had absolutely no intention of starting now. Long before American boots ever touched Philippine soil, the Moros had already written one of history's most remarkable stories of resistance. For over 300 years, the Spanish Empire, one of the most powerful colonial forces the world had ever seen, repeatedly failed to conquer the Muslim South. Where Spanish missionaries and soldiers succeeded across most of the archipelago, they were consistently repelled in Mindanao and the Sulu Islands. At the heart of this defiance stood two extraordinary institutions, the Sultanate of Sulu and the Sultanate of Maguindanao. These were not simple tribal chiefdoms. They were sophisticated political and religious powers, commanding loyalty through Islamic law, royal lineage, and centuries of tradition. Their rulers held both spiritual and military authority, making resistance not just political, but sacred. When America arrived claiming ownership of these same lands, the Moros saw nothing new, only another foreign power making the same fatal mistake Spain had made before them. In 1898, following the Spanish-American War, the United States signed the Treaty of Paris, acquiring the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. What Spain handed over, however, was never truly theirs to give. The Moros of Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago had never surrendered to Spanish rule, and they certainly had no intention of submitting to a new foreign power. Initially, American military commanders recognized the delicacy of the situation. Rather than immediately deploying force, they pursued diplomacy. In 1899, General John Bates sat down with the Sultan of Sulu, Jamalul Kiram II, and negotiated what became known as the Bates Treaty. On paper, it seemed like a reasonable arrangement. The United States would respect Moro customs and the Sultan's authority, while the Sultan acknowledged American presence in the region. But the agreement carried a fatal flaw. Both sides walked away with completely different understandings of what they had actually agreed to. The ink on the Bates Treaty had barely dried before the cracks began to show. Americans viewed the agreement as a clear declaration of United States sovereignty over Moro lands, granting them full authority to govern, tax, and administer the region as they saw fit. The Sultan of Sulu, however, understood something entirely different. To him, the treaty was a loose protectorate arrangement, one that preserved his authority and left his people largely autonomous. These two interpretations could not coexist. As confusion turned into confrontation, the United States made its position official. In 1904, Washington formally abrogated the Bates Treaty, effectively tearing up the agreement and signaling a harder line toward the Moro people. Simultaneously, American military forces began pushing deeper into Mindanao and the Sulu Islands, constructing forts and establishing garrisons across the region. For the Moros, this was not governance arriving. It was occupation. And occupation, as history had already shown, would never go unanswered. As American boots pressed deeper into Moro territory, resistance ignited swiftly and violently. Local datus, unwilling to bow to foreign authority, rallied their warriors and launched fierce attacks against American garrisons across Mindanao and the Sulu Islands. General Adna Chaffee, commanding American forces in the Philippines, recognized the severity of the threat, but it was General Leonard Wood who would come to define American military policy toward the Moros. Wood was unyielding, viewing Moro resistance not as legitimate defiance, but as lawless rebellion requiring total suppression. The Moro warriors themselves were formidable opponents, armed with the kreese, a wavy double-edged blade, and the barong, a heavy leaf-shaped sword. They were skilled and fearless in close combat. Most terrifying to American soldiers was the practice of juramentado. A warrior would ritually purify himself, bind his body tightly to slow bleeding, then charge headlong into enemy lines, slashing until killed. It was suicidal, sacred, and absolutely devastating to encounter. With diplomacy abandoned, General Leonard Wood wasted no time unleashing the full force of American military power across the Moro province. Beginning around 1903, Wood launched a series of aggressive campaigns, pushing deep into Mindanao and the Sulu Islands, determined to crush any resistance that dared challenge American authority. Villages were burned, strongholds dismantled, and Moro communities that refused submission faced overwhelming firepower. The clashes were brutal and relentless. But nothing would define this period more than the events of March 1906 on the island of Jolo. Hundreds of Moros, desperate and cornered, had retreated to the crater of an extinct volcano called Budejo. Among them were not just warriors, but women, children, and elderly civilians seeking refuge from the advancing American forces. Rather than waiting them out, Wood ordered a direct assault on the crater. What followed would shock the conscience of a nation still wrestling with what it truly meant to be an empire. On March 5, 1906, General Leonard Wood ordered his forces to storm the crater of Budejo. Roughly 1,000 Moros, including women and children, had fortified themselves inside the volcanic rim, refusing all demands to surrender. American soldiers, along with Philippine scouts, climbed the steep jungle slopes from multiple directions under heavy fire. The fighting was brutal and close range. Moro warriors armed with blades and rifles held their ground with extraordinary ferocity, but American firepower proved overwhelming. When the guns finally fell silent, somewhere between 600 and 1,000 Moros lay dead. American casualties numbered around 21 killed and 75 wounded. News of the slaughter reached the United States and ignited immediate outrage. Mark Twain published a scathing essay calling it a massacre, not a battle. He questioned the entire premise of American imperial ambition in the Philippines, asking what moral authority justified such bloodshed against people defending their own homeland. Despite the outrage sparked by Budejo, American military operations across the Moro province showed no signs of slowing down. Washington pressed forward, determined to bring the region firmly under colonial control. To manage this volatile territory, the United States established the Moro Province in 1903, a specially administered zone separate from the broader Philippine colonial government. American officials believed that gradual integration was the path forward. They moved to abolish slavery, a practice deeply embedded in Moro society for centuries. They worked to strip traditional datus of their political and judicial authority, replacing centuries-old power structures with American-style courts, councils, and bureaucracies. Schools were built, English was promoted, and Western education was introduced as a tool of cultural transformation. But to the Moro people, these were not reforms. They were attacks on their identity, their faith, and their way of life. Every policy designed to civilize them felt like another act of conquest, and resentment continued to simmer beneath the surface. Even as American administrators worked to reshape Moro society, armed resistance refused to die. Across the Moro province, smaller uprisings flared constantly, datus leading raids, warriors ambushing patrols, communities refusing to submit to colonial authority. No single decisive battle had broken the Moro spirit, and American commanders knew it. In 1909, a new figure arrived to take command of the Moro province, General John Pershing. The same man who would later lead American forces in World War I was now tasked with pacifying one of the most stubborn resistance movements the United States military had ever faced. Pershing recognized immediately that Leonard Wood's purely aggressive approach had deepened resentment without achieving lasting peace. He shifted strategy, blending continued military pressure with genuine diplomatic outreach. He met personally with Moro Datus, offered economic incentives, and attempted to address local grievances directly. It was a more calculated approach, but no less determined to achieve full American control. Pershing's relatively measured approach brought a degree of calm to the Moro province, but his most consequential decision would reignite the flames of resistance. In 1911, Pershing issued a disarmament order requiring all Moros to surrender their weapons. To outside observers, this seemed like a reasonable step toward pacification. To the Moros, it was an existential assault on their identity. Weapons were not merely tools of war. They were symbols of manhood, honor, and spiritual protection. The crisp blade was as much a cultural artifact as it was a weapon. Surrendering it meant surrendering dignity itself. Many Moros simply refused. Some complied outwardly while hiding weapons in secret. Others openly defied the order and retreated to fortified highland positions to make their stand. Tensions escalated rapidly across the island of Jolo. By 1913, a large force of defiant Moro warriors had gathered at a fortified hilltop called Bud Bagsak, setting the stage for the final catastrophic confrontation of the entire rebellion. In June 1913, General Pershing personally led a combined force of American soldiers and Philippine scouts to the slopes of Bud Bagsak on the island of Jolo. The mountain fortress was heavily reinforced with layered wooden stockades called kotas, manned by hundreds of determined Moro warriors who had refused to surrender their weapons. The assault stretched across multiple days, beginning on June 11th. Pershing coordinated a methodical tightening of forces around the mountain, cutting off escape routes while infantry units pushed uphill through dense jungle terrain under constant fire. The fighting was brutal and close range, with Moro defenders launching fierce countercharges even as their positions collapsed one by one. By June 15th, the final stronghold fell. Estimates placed Moro deaths between 300 and 500 fighters. American and Scout casualties were significant, but far lower. Bud Bagsak shattered the last organized, large-scale military resistance the Moro people could mount against American colonial authority. With the fall of Bud Bagsak, organized Moro resistance collapsed, but the wounds never truly healed. The United States declared the Moro Rebellion officially over in 1913, yet scattered fighting persisted for years across Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago. The human cost was staggering. Thousands of Moro men, women, and children killed, entire communities shattered, and a culture deliberately undermined by colonial policy. The sultanates were weakened, the warrior traditions suppressed, and deep resentment was buried into the soil of the South. Those grievances never disappeared. Decades later, they resurfaced in insurgencies, separatist movements, and ongoing conflicts that still shape the southern Philippines today. The Moro Rebellion is not simply a forgotten chapter of American imperial history. It is a warning. When outside powers dismiss the identity, faith, and sovereignty of a people in pursuit of strategic ambition, the consequences echo across generations, long after the last battle has been declared won.